Jason had come to pick up his daughter. He wasn't prepared to find his parents already acting like they lived there. The sound reached him before he opened the gate. A child's laughter, bright and breathless, spilling across the small backyard behind Laura Mitchell's house. Jason slowed beside the driveway. Through the kitchen window, he saw his 7-year-old daughter, Sophie, standing on a chair while his father held 2 uneven pieces of cedar together. Robert Mitchell had sawdust on his sweater. Diane stood beside them with a plate of cookies, laughing as Sophie tried to explain something with both hands. For a moment, Jason simply watched. Then Laura appeared behind them carrying 4 glasses of lemonade. 4. He opened the front door with the key Laura still allowed him to use for pickups. Sophie's face lit up. Dad. She jumped down and ran toward him. Jason caught her automatically, kissing the top of her head. Hey, Bug. Grandpa and I are building a birdhouse. But he measured it wrong. I did not, Robert called from the kitchen. You absolutely did, Diane said. Jason lowered Sophie slowly. His eyes moved from his daughter to his parents, then to Laura. She stood near the counter in jeans and a pale sweater, one hand still wrapped around the lemonade pitcher. What are you doing here? Jason asked. The room changed. Not dramatically. No one raised their voice. But Laura's fingers tightened slightly around the glass handle. Robert set down the wood. Diane looked at her son. Visiting our granddaughter. Jason frowned. I can see that. Sophie tugged his sleeve. Grandma brought the chocolate chip cookies with the little salt things on top. Sea salt, Diane corrected gently. Jason barely heard her. He looked at Laura again. You knew they were coming? Laura held his gaze. Yes. Today. They come most Saturdays. Silence. Jason turned toward his mother. Most Saturdays? Diane's expression softened, as though she had suddenly understood the real question beneath his words. For a while now. How long is a while? Robert cleared his throat. Sophie looked between the adults, sensing something she couldn't name. Laura noticed first. She placed the pitcher down and crouched beside her daughter. Why don't you show your dad the roof you painted? Sophie brightened instantly and grabbed a small wooden panel covered in uneven blue brushstrokes. It's supposed to look like the sky. Jason took it. It does. Grandpa says birds don't care if the lines are crooked. Smart birds. Sophie smiled. Jason did too, but something inside him remained strangely still. He noticed the details now. His father knew where Laura kept the toolbox. His mother opened the correct cabinet for napkins without asking. Sophie's half-finished homework sat beside a cookie Diane had apparently cut in half, because she knew Sophie never finished a whole one before lunch. None of this looked new. That was the part Jason couldn't shake. These weren't guests learning their way around his ex-wife's house. This was a routine. A life continuing quietly without him. Before leaving, Robert lifted the unfinished birdhouse. Next Saturday, kiddo? Promise? Sophie asked. Promise. Jason looked at his father. Then at Laura. Next Saturday too? Laura didn't defend herself. She didn't apologize. Jason, they're her grandparents. He looked toward Sophie, who was brushing sawdust from Diane's sleeve. Jason knew Laura was right. That almost made the feeling worse. Because standing in the kitchen of the house he had once called home, watching his parents laugh with the daughter he loved, Jason felt something he had never expected after the divorce. He didn't feel replaced as a husband. He felt replaced as someone who knew how to show up. The first Saturday after the divorce, Laura expected silence. Instead, at 9:12 in the morning, her doorbell rang. She had been standing barefoot in the kitchen, staring at a pancake Sophie had abandoned after 3 bites, when she opened the door and found Diane Mitchell on the porch holding a canvas grocery bag. Robert stood behind her with a red toolbox. For a second, Laura didn't know what to say. 6 days earlier, she had watched their son carry the last of his boxes out of this house. Diane, would it be all right if we saw Sophie? Diane asked. There was something unusually careful in her voice. Laura looked at Robert. What's the toolbox for? Sophie said her dollhouse door fell off. She told you that. Yesterday. Before Laura could answer, small footsteps raced down the hallway. Grandma. Sophie flew past her. Diane dropped the grocery bag just in time to catch her. Robert smiled and knelt beside them, opening his arms. Laura stood in the doorway watching her daughter disappear into the same embrace she had known since infancy. Something inside Laura loosened. Come in, she said. That morning became the first Saturday. Diane made pancakes shaped badly enough that Sophie insisted they looked like clouds. Robert repaired the dollhouse door, then spent another hour fixing things nobody had asked him to fix. When they finally left, Diane paused beside Laura. "We don't want to make things difficult." Laura understood what she meant. Jason, the divorce. Boundaries that hadn't existed before. "You're her grandparents," Laura said quietly. "You never have to ask me whether you can love your granddaughter." Diane's eyes filled, but she only nodded. The next Saturday, they returned. Then the next. Weeks became months. Saturday mornings developed their own rhythm. Robert taught Sophie to ride a bicycle in the driveway, running behind her until she shouted, "Let go," and discovered he already had. Diane learned that Sophie wanted strawberry jam spread all the way to the corners of her toast, but refused to eat the crust. They attended school plays, helped with science projects, remembered library days. When Sophie lost her first tooth, Robert arrived with a tiny wooden box he had made for it. Laura never formally invited them into her new life. They simply remained part of Sophie's. And nobody told Jason. Not because it was hidden. Laura assumed his parents mentioned it. Diane assumed Sophie did. Robert assumed Jason knew because, in Robert's words, why wouldn't he? The truth was simpler and sadder. After the divorce, Jason and his parents spoke about practical things. Work, bills, Sunday football, whether Robert's knee still hurt. They rarely spoke about Laura's house. So Saturday continued quietly beyond his view. Pancakes, bike rides, homework, cookies, a birdhouse waiting to be built. By the time Jason finally walked into Laura's kitchen and discovered the tradition, everyone else had stopped thinking of it as unusual. But Jason saw what they couldn't. His father knew which shelf held Sophie's paints. His mother knew the name of Sophie's teacher. They knew about the loose tooth, the piano song, the birdhouse. Details. Tiny, ordinary details. The kind that only accumulated when someone kept showing up. And as Jason stood there holding the blue-painted roof Sophie had proudly placed in his hands, he began to understand that Saturday had not become important because his parents were taking something from him. It had become important because while he was trying to build a life after divorce, they had quietly made sure Sophie never felt that her family had disappeared with his marriage. Jason had always believed he knew his daughter's life. Then he realized his parents knew the parts he kept missing. The Saturday after discovering the weekly visits, Jason arrived 10 minutes early for Sophie's pickup. He told himself traffic had been lighter than expected. Laura knew better. She opened the door without commenting. From the backyard came the rhythmic tap of a hammer. Jason stepped through the kitchen and stopped beside the window. Robert and Sophie were finishing the birdhouse. Sophie held one side steady while her grandfather carefully drove a nail into the roof. "Not too hard," Robert said. "Why?" "Because cedar splits when you rush it." Sophie nodded seriously, storing the information as though it might appear on a test. Jason watched from behind the glass. "She likes building things now." Laura stood at the counter packing Sophie's overnight bag. "For about 6 months." Jason looked at her. 6 months. Laura folded a sweatshirt. "She made a bridge for her school project in March. I thought that was a science poster." Laura paused, then continued packing. She didn't correct him. Somehow that felt worse. Diane entered from the backyard carrying an empty lemonade pitcher. "Jason, you're early." Apparently. She opened the refrigerator without asking and reached directly for the filtered water. Jason noticed. "Again. How's Mrs. Reynolds?" Diane asked Laura. Jason glanced between them. "Who's Mrs. Reynolds?" Sophie answered through the open screen door. "My teacher, Dad." "I thought your teacher was Mr. Collins." "That was last year." Sophie returned to the birdhouse. Jason said nothing. Diane's face softened. "She really likes Mrs. Reynolds." "I gathered that." He walked outside. Sophie was painting a tiny yellow sun beneath the roof. "Want to help?" she asked. Jason smiled. "Sure." She handed him a brush. "Not that one. That's Grandpa's." Jason froze for half a second, then accepted another brush from the jar. It was ridiculous. A paintbrush. Nothing more. But the feeling followed him through the afternoon. Robert knew Sophie wanted the birdhouse mounted where she could see it from her bedroom. Diane knew she had started piano lessons. Laura knew Sophie was nervous about an upcoming school presentation. Jason knew she liked pepperoni pizza and hated bedtime. Suddenly, those facts felt old. On the drive to his apartment, Sophie talked without stopping. "Grandpa says we can build a bird feeder next." Grandma says I can sleep over Friday because we're making pancakes Saturday. Oh, and Mrs. Reynolds picked me for the school reading thing. Jason glanced at her in the mirror. The school reading thing? I told you. His hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. When Sophie thought about it. Maybe I told Grandma. Then she looked out the window, already moving on. Jason didn't. That evening, after Sophie fell asleep, he sat alone at his kitchen table and opened the school parent app he usually skimmed between meetings. There it was. Reading night. Thursday, 6:30 p.m. 3 reminders. He had missed all 3. Jason leaned back and stared at the ceiling. His parents hadn't taken his place. Laura hadn't pushed him out. No one had built a wall between him and Sophie. The truth was less comfortable because there was nobody to blame. Somewhere between deadlines, custody schedules, and convincing himself that providing for his daughter counted as being present, Jason had begun arriving for the large moments while other people collected the small ones. And childhood, he was beginning to understand, was mostly made of small ones. Jason expected a school drawing to show him what Sophie loved. Instead, it showed him exactly where he stood. Thursday evening, the elementary school hallways glowed beneath fluorescent lights and strings of construction paper stars. Laura walked beside Jason toward Sophie's classroom, close enough to look like a family from behind, distant enough that neither accidentally touched the other. Sophie raced ahead. Mine's on the blue wall. Children's drawings covered the classroom beneath a banner reading My Family. Sophie stopped proudly before hers. 5 figures stood beneath an enormous yellow sun. Diane wore purple. Robert had impossibly long arms. Sophie stood in the middle wearing a pink dress. Laura was on the far left. Jason was on the far right. Jason smiled at first. Then he noticed the distance. Why did you put Mom and me so far apart? Sophie looked at the picture as if the answer were obvious. Because you live in different houses. Laura glanced at Jason. He nodded slowly. Right. Sophie pointed at the figures. But Grandma is holding my hand, and Grandpa is holding yours, and Mom is holding Grandma's. Jason leaned closer. Crayon lines connected each oversized hand. Everybody is still holding somebody, Sophie said. Then she ran toward another display before either parent could answer. Jason remained in front of the drawing. Laura stood beside him. She seems okay, he said quietly. She is. Does she ever ask about us? Laura knew what he meant. About us getting back together? Jason nodded. No, something crossed his face. Relief mixed with something harder to name. She asked once why we couldn't all have dinner together anymore. Laura continued. What did you tell her? That families can change without disappearing. Jason looked back at the drawing. Later, Mrs. Reynolds approached with a warm smile. Sophie talks about you all the time. Jason straightened. Hopefully nothing too embarrassing. Mostly about the birdhouse. Jason's smile weakened. The birdhouse. She says her grandfather taught her how to measure twice before cutting. Laura saw. Jason's jaw tightened slightly. Mrs. Reynolds didn't notice. And she's very excited about reading night next month. I'll be here, Jason said. The answer came too quickly, almost like a promise made to himself. On the drive home, Sophie sat in the back seat between Laura's tote bag and her school projects. Dad, yeah, Bug. Can you come Saturday? Jason glanced at her through the mirror. To Grandma and Grandpa's? No, to my house. Grandpa says the birdhouse needs a post. Laura looked toward him from the passenger seat. Jason hesitated only a second. Yeah, I can come. Sophie smiled and returned to coloring. After they reached Laura's house, Jason carried the family drawing inside because Sophie insisted it couldn't bend. He placed it carefully on the kitchen counter. For several seconds, he stared at those 5 crooked figures again. Sophie hadn't drawn a broken family. She hadn't drawn 2 separate families either. She had simply drawn the people who kept showing up, arranged according to the reality she understood. Jason touched the edge of the paper. For weeks, he had been quietly resenting how naturally his parents still belonged inside Sophie's daily life. But the drawing exposed something uncomfortable. There was still a place for him. Sophie had never erased it. He had simply been standing too far away from the center and wondering why everyone else looked closer. Jason finally said the thing he had been ashamed to admit. Sometimes, watching his parents with Sophie made him feel like they had become better grandparents because he had become a worse father. Saturday morning arrived beneath a pale blue sky. Jason showed up at Laura's house, carrying a bag of concrete mix for the birdhouse post and 2 coffees. Laura opened the door and looked at the bag. Planning to build a highway? Dad said we needed concrete. Your father also owns 17 screwdrivers. Fair point. In the backyard, Sophie immediately put Jason to work. Robert showed him where to dig. Diane sat at the patio table helping Sophie paint tiny white clouds along the birdhouse roof. For an hour, everything felt almost ordinary. Then Robert took Sophie inside to wash paint from her hands, and Diane followed with the empty cups. Jason remained beside the newly planted post, pressing loose soil around its base with his shoe. Laura gathered brushes nearby. You can say it, he said. Say what? That I should have known about reading night. Laura stopped. I wasn't going to. Maybe you should. She studied him. Jason kept looking at the ground. Dad knows her teacher's name. Mom knows what song she's learning on piano. I didn't even know she started piano. Laura set the brushes down. Jason, sometimes I look at them with her and think they became better grandparents after I became a worse father. The words hung between them. Laura could have softened them. Once, during their marriage, she probably would have. She would have told him he worked hard, that Sophie adored him, that divorce was complicated. Instead, she asked, do you think you're a bad father? Jason finally looked at her. I think I've missed more than I realized. That wasn't my question. His jaw tightened. No, I don't think I'm a bad father. Neither do I. Relief flickered across his face, but Laura wasn't finished. But being a good father isn't something you get to decide once and keep forever. Jason looked toward the kitchen window. Sophie was laughing while Robert held her hands beneath running water. I thought Mom and Dad were taking my place. They're not. It feels like they know her better than I do. Laura's voice stayed calm. Because they keep showing up. That landed. Jason turned back toward her. They didn't replace you, Jason. She paused. They just kept showing up. No anger. No triumph. That made the truth harder to avoid. Jason looked at the birdhouse standing between them. Then what am I supposed to do? Laura picked up the brushes again. Show up. The back door opened. Sophie ran outside with wet sleeves and a crooked grin. Dad, Grandpa says the concrete has to sit before we put the birdhouse on. Grandpa's right. Can you come back tomorrow? Jason glanced at Laura. She gave him no signal, no permission disguised as encouragement. This choice belonged to him. Yeah, he said. I can. Sophie smiled. And Thursday is reading night. I know. She narrowed her eyes suspiciously. Actually, no? Jason laughed. Actually, no. That Thursday, he arrived at the school 20 minutes early. Sophie spotted him from across the classroom and waved so hard her entire arm moved. Jason lifted a hand back. It was a tiny moment. No applause. No grand forgiveness. Just a father sitting in a folding chair before his daughter had to wonder whether it would stay empty. And for the first time since the divorce, Jason understood that being present wasn't about reclaiming a place someone had stolen. It was about returning again and again, until Sophie never had to question whether the place was his. Sophie didn't want 2 birthday cakes. She wanted one room where nobody she loved had to disappear. 3 weeks before her 8th birthday, Laura sat at the kitchen table with 2 lists in front of her. Saturday afternoon, Sophie's classmates, Diane, Robert, cake, balloons. Sunday evening, Jason, pizza, another cake, presents. It seemed practical, clean, no awkward conversations, no careful glances across the backyard. Sophie wandered in wearing mismatched socks and stopped beside the table. What's that? Birthday plans. Sophie leaned over Laura's shoulder. Why does it say Saturday and Sunday? You're having 2 celebrations this year. Sophie's eyes widened. 2 cakes. Laura smiled. Probably. For approximately 3 seconds, this seemed like excellent news. Then Sophie studied the lists again. Is Dad coming Saturday? Dad will celebrate with you Sunday. Why? Laura hesitated. Because Saturday will be easier for everyone this way. Sophie frowned. Who's everyone? The question caught Laura off guard. The grown-ups. Grandma and Grandpa are grown-ups. Yes. They see Dad. Of course they do. And they see you. Laura folded her hands. Sophie, so why can't Dad come? There was no anger in the child's voice. Only confusion. Laura pulled out the chair beside her. Your dad and I don't live together anymore. Sometimes that means we do things separately. Sophie climbed onto the chair. Because you got divorced? Yes. Sophie looked again at the 2 lists. But I didn't. Laura went. Still. Sophie traced her finger down Saturday's names. Grandma's here. Grandpa's here. You're here. Then she tapped Sunday. Dad's here. Her small forehead creased. Why do I have to have 2 birthdays because you got divorced? Laura had prepared answers for difficult questions about marriage, separation, and why Mom and Dad lived in different houses. She had no prepared answer for that one. That night, after Sophie went to bed, Laura stood alone in the kitchen staring at the lists. She remembered Sophie's family drawing. 5 people separated across a page, but connected by crooked crayon hands. She picked up her phone. Jason answered on the 3rd ring. Everything okay? Yes. Laura looked at the 2 schedules. I was planning Sophie's birthday. A pause. Okay. I made 2 parties. Jason was quiet. Because of me? Because of us. Neither spoke for a moment. Laura exhaled. She asked why. What did you tell her? Apparently nothing convincing. Jason gave a faint laugh. Laura smiled despite herself. Then her voice softened. 1 party. Silence again, but this one felt different. Jason looked across his apartment at the calendar on the wall. Reading night was marked in blue. Saturday visits were marked in green. Sophie's birthday was circled twice. 1 party, he said. Laura crossed out Sunday. 3 o'clock. I'll be there. Jason. Yeah. Don't say that unless you mean it. His eyes stayed on the calendar. He understood what she was really saying. This wasn't about cake. I mean it. The morning of the party, the backyard filled with yellow balloons and paper flowers. Robert hung a banner crookedly. Diane brought enough food for twice the guest list. Sophie raced between them wearing a birthday crown. At 2:55, Laura glanced toward the gate. No Jason. At 3, guests began arriving. At 3:15, his chair remained empty. Laura checked her phone. Nothing. Sophie didn't ask where he was. Somehow, that worried Laura more. At 3:27, Sophie quietly straightened the paper plate waiting at his place. And for the first time that afternoon, Laura understood that combining 2 birthday parties had been the easy part. The difficult part was whether Jason had truly learned what showing up meant. At 3:42, Sophie stopped looking at the gate. And that was the moment Laura began to worry Jason might not come at all. The backyard was full of children chasing yellow balloons between folding chairs. Diane carried lemonade from table to table while Robert stood beside the cake, trying unsuccessfully to keep 8-year-olds from touching the frosting. Laura smiled when someone looked at her, but her eyes kept returning to the empty chair near Sophie's place. Jason had promised. At 3:50, Sophie opened another present. At 4, Laura checked her phone beneath the table. Nothing. Maybe traffic, Diane said quietly. Laura looked up. She hadn't realized Jason's mother was watching too. Maybe. Diane folded a napkin twice. He said he'd be here. Laura heard the disappointment beneath the words. Let's not do this in front of Sophie. Diane nodded. Across the yard, Sophie laughed as a friend placed a paper crown sideways on her head. She looked happy. That was what mattered. At least Laura kept telling herself that. At 4:15, Robert carried out the cake. 8 pink candles flickered in the afternoon breeze. Everybody, he called. Children crowded around the table. Sophie climbed into her chair. The seat beside her remained empty. Laura crouched near her. Ready? Sophie nodded. Then she looked toward the gate one last time. The latch moved. Jason stepped into the backyard. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled unevenly, and he was breathing as though he had run the final block. Sophie's entire face changed. Dad! She jumped from her chair. Jason barely had time to bend before she collided with him. He wrapped both arms around her. I'm sorry I'm late, sophomore. You came. 3 words. No accusation. Somehow they hit harder. Jason closed his eyes briefly. I said I would. Over Sophie's shoulder, he met Laura's gaze. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. He was there. Jason had spent the afternoon trapped in a meeting that had already run 40 minutes over. 6 months earlier, he would have stayed, checking his watch and telling himself Sophie would understand. Today, when his manager said, "We need another hour," Jason had closed his laptop. I don't have another hour. He had left before anyone could negotiate. Now he knelt beside Sophie while she blew out her candles. Robert handed him a paper plate. Diane quietly straightened his collar the way she had when he was a boy. Nobody applauded his arrival. Nobody treated it as heroic. Showing up for your child wasn't supposed to be heroic. That was precisely why it mattered. Later, Jason helped Sophie open presents and spent 20 minutes assembling a toy telescope with Robert. When one of Sophie's classmates asked who he was, Sophie answered without looking up. That's my dad. Simple. Certain. Jason swallowed. As sunset softened the backyard, the guests began leaving. Balloons sagged against chair backs. Wrapping paper collected beneath the table. Diane and Robert offered to take Sophie for ice cream so Laura could clean up. Can Dad come? Sophie asked. Jason looked at Laura. Before either could answer, Robert smiled. Your dad has something to finish here. Sophie accepted that and raced toward the car. When the gate closed behind them, the backyard became suddenly quiet. Laura began gathering paper cups. Jason picked up a trash bag. For several minutes, they worked without speaking. Then Jason looked at the empty chair beside Sophie's place, the one that had waited for him nearly an hour. I almost missed it, he said. Laura folded the tablecloth. But you didn't. Jason stared at the chair. For once, he understood there was a difference between being late and being absent. And there was still time to stop becoming the second one. After the balloons came down, Jason finally understood that no one had taken his family from him. He had simply mistaken their presence for proof of his absence. The backyard looked strangely larger without the children. Crushed paper cups filled a black trash bag. A yellow balloon dragged across the grass in the evening breeze, its ribbon catching briefly around the leg of Sophie's empty chair. Laura folded the last tablecloth while Jason gathered wrapping paper near the fence. Diane and Robert had taken Sophie for ice cream, leaving behind the kind of silence that made ordinary sounds feel louder. Jason tied the trash bag and looked toward the birdhouse near the garden. I owe you an apology. Laura stopped folding. For being late? For more than that. Jason leaned against the table. When I found Mom and Dad here that first Saturday, I was angry. I noticed. A faint smile touched his mouth, then disappeared. I thought they were choosing you. Laura's expression changed slightly. Over you. Maybe. He looked embarrassed by the admission. This was my house once. You were my wife. They were my parents. Then suddenly, I'm standing outside a window watching everyone continue without me. Laura placed the folded tablecloth down. Jason, they weren't choosing me. I know that now. Do you? He looked at her. Laura nodded toward the small pink jacket Sophie had left over a chair. They were choosing her. Jason followed her gaze. Your mother never came here asking questions about our divorce. Your father never tried to convince me you were right or I was wrong. They came because Sophie wanted pancakes. Because she needed someone at her school play. Because her dollhouse door broke. Laura paused. They kept being her grandparents. Jason lowered his eyes. While I was busy feeling replaced. You were hurting. That doesn't make me right. Laura didn't argue. The old Jason might have needed her to. The man standing before her seemed to need the truth more. He walked toward the birdhouse and touched the wooden post he had helped set weeks earlier. I used to think divorce took this away from me. What? The ordinary stuff. His hand rested against the cedar. Breakfast. Homework. Hearing about her day before it becomes a story someone tells me later. Laura stood beside him, leaving space between them. Divorce changed where you live. It didn't decide how present you are. Jason nodded slowly. Absence did. The words stayed between them. No accusation. Just recognition. A car door slammed beyond the fence. Sophie's laughter followed. Jason turned instinctively toward the sound. Laura noticed how quickly he moved now. Diane opened the gate, and Sophie ran in carrying a melting chocolate cone. Dad, Grandpa says next Saturday we can make a bird feeder. Jason crouched as she reached him. Next Saturday? You have to help. What time? Sophie blinked, surprised by the question. Morning. That's not a time. 9. 9 it is. Robert stepped through the gate and heard him. Bring work gloves. Jason looked at his father. Months ago, the invitation might have sounded like a reminder that Robert already belonged here. Tonight, it sounded exactly like what it was, an invitation. I will. Sophie grabbed Jason's hand with one sticky hand and Laura's with the other. Come see what Grandma bought me. Neither parent pulled away. For 3 steps, Sophie walked between them toward the house, linking two people who no longer belonged to each other but still belonged to her. Jason looked down at their joined hands and finally understood the difference. Their marriage had ended. Fatherhood hadn't. Family hadn't. Love hadn't become smaller. It had simply changed shape, and the only question left was whether the adults were brave enough to change with it. By the time Saturday mornings stopped belonging to his parents alone, Jason had learned something the divorce papers never explained. Leaving a marriage and leaving a family were not the same thing. For months after Sophie's birthday, Laura heard a car door close outside at exactly 9. She looked through the kitchen window, expecting Diane and Robert. Their silver sedan was there, but beside it sat Jason's car. Sophie appeared in the hallway wearing one sneaker. "They're here." She raced toward the door, stopped, looked down, and groaned. "Other shoe." Laura laughed. Usually helpful. By the time Sophie found it, the doorbell rang. She opened the door and threw herself into Diane's arms. Robert stood behind her carrying a toolbox. Jason was beside him with several pieces of cedar tucked beneath one arm. "What's that?" Sophie demanded. "Bird feeder," Jason said. "Grandpa says the birdhouse needs neighbors." Robert frowned. "I said the yard needs more birds." "Same concept." Sophie grabbed Jason's hand. "Come on." The three of them disappeared toward the backyard before anyone removed their jackets. Diane stepped inside and handed Laura a paper coffee cup. "Hazelnut. 1 sugar." Laura looked at it. "You remembered." Diane gave her the kind of look that made the question unnecessary. Outside, Robert arranged wood across the patio table while Jason helped Sophie measure each piece. "Twice," Sophie announced. "We measure twice." "And cut once," Robert finished. Jason smiled. "I've heard." Laura stood in the doorway with her coffee, watching. Months earlier, Jason had stood behind almost the same window believing this scene proved he had been replaced. Now he was inside it. Not because anyone had moved aside for him. Because he had begun arriving. Reading night became soccer practice. Soccer practice became Saturday breakfast. He learned Mrs. Reynolds drank terrible vending machine coffee, and that Sophie played Ode to Joy too quickly whenever she was nervous. He knew which library books were overdue. He knew she had stopped liking pepperoni pizza and now insisted mushrooms were more sophisticated. None of it was dramatic. That was the point. "Mom," Sophie called. Laura looked up. "We need another pair of hands." She glanced toward Jason. He was holding 2 pieces of cedar together while Sophie tried to position a screw. "Apparently I've been promoted," Laura said. Jason shifted one board toward her. "Don't get excited. You're temporary labor." She rolled her eyes and stepped outside. For the next 20 minutes, the 5 of them worked around the patio table. Diane took photographs nobody asked for. Robert criticized Jason's measurements. Sophie painted a crooked red roof. Laura held the wood steady. At one point, her hand brushed Jason's. Neither pulled away sharply. Neither made the moment larger than it was. When the feeder was finished, Sophie insisted everyone carry it to the maple tree. Jason lifted her so she could pour in the first cup of seed. Then they stepped back together. "How long until birds come?" Sophie asked. "Could be 5 minutes," Robert said. "Could be tomorrow." Sophie sighed dramatically. "That's forever." Everyone laughed. Laura looked at Jason. There had been a time when seeing him beside his parents would have reminded her of everything she no longer belonged to. Now she understood belonging differently. Jason wasn't her husband. Diane and Robert weren't technically her in-laws anymore. Yet Sophie stood between all of them, watching an empty bird feeder with absolute faith that something would eventually arrive. Jason caught Laura looking at him and gave a small smile. Nothing romantic was promised inside it. Nothing needed to be. Their marriage belonged to the past. Their responsibility to Sophie did not. The divorce had changed the shape of the family, but it did not have to shrink the love inside it. And as Sophie reached for her father's hand with one hand and her grandmother's with the other, Laura understood the simplest truth of all. A child should never have to lose people who love her just because 2 adults could no longer love each other the same way.